Hello and welcome to the IEA channel. I'm Emma Revell, Head of Public Affairs, and today I'm joined by Harry Phibbs, journalist and former Conservative Party councillor, for this first in the series of videos on the levelling up agenda, asking how and why successive governments have failed to address the challenges of levelling up and what needs to be done going forward. One of the biggest policy issues of the 2019 general election, levelling up looked set to be the buzzword of 2020 until coronavirus emerged in Asia and swept the news agenda. That said, COVID-19 has impacted different regions of the UK in different ways, and many have argued that the so-called left behind Britain has been hit harder, highlighting the importance of regional growth. But debates remain over the best way to improve the life chances of people living and working in Britain's less affluent areas. Following the promotion of Kwasi Kwarteng to Business Secretary in early January, Times political columnist Rachel Sylvester wrote an article arguing that attitudes within the government to the levelling up agenda, saying that tensions between the Britannia Unchained faction of government, who want to remove the dead hand of the state, and the levelling up brigade, who want to extend the power of government, is going to be a defining theme of this year. Harry, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started doing, a deep dive into the levelling up agenda and dividing lines of the government, can you explain for listeners who maybe aren't aware what Britannia Unchained is and who are the people that Rachel was referring to in her Times piece?
Well, it's one of these things that shows it's good to try and keep your old political tracts on, if you can fit them on your shelves, because this came out back in 2012, and it was written by a group of Conservative MPs, and they all seem to have done very well for themselves. There's Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng, Chris Skidmore, I think the only one who isn't holding a great office of state. And I described them, I mean, you would be able to say if this was fair, of having a sort of semi-detached relationship with the IEA, having sort of squatters' rights. That they were. I don't think that anything they said you had to endorse, or anything you said they had to endorse. But there was a friendly encouragement for them, and it was at a time when obviously David Cameron was the Prime Minister and trying to manage the sort of delicate coalition government with the Lib Dems, and so I'm not quite sure how grateful he would have been for some really strong, bold, outspoken free market messages, and they might have got told off at the time for causing trouble. But anyway, it obviously hasn't done them too much long-term harm.
They had some quite radical ideas in the book as well. I'm not sure how receptive David Cameron was to them at the time. They probably didn't appreciate their intervention. But as Rachel notes in her piece, they've gone on to hold quite senior offices in subsequent and indeed the current cabinet. We'll link both to Rachel's article in the Times and Britannia Unchained itself in the show notes on YouTube. But Rachel was basically arguing that the views of these particular ministers were quite contrary to the levelling up agenda, and that there was going to be a sort of a butting of heads. You wrote a response piece for CapX arguing that the libertarians versus levelling up was a false divide. I think many people on the free market side of politics are concerned that levelling up is primarily seen as being achieved through large infrastructure projects and a lot of taxpayer-funded spending, if I get my words out. How confident are you that actually that is a false divide, and that levelling up doesn't necessarily mean it's in opposition to libertarianism?
Well, I think it's the means to levelling up, isn't it? What I was saying was that the idea that it was somehow automatically at odds with the libertarian free market approach was wrong, and I also noted that the origins of the phrase levelling up come from the Thatcher era, and quoted it from The Right Approach, which was published when just before Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, but she was already Conservative Party leader, and in a way it was sort of challenging the socialist egalitarian idea of levelling down and trying to punish the rich by saying, well, no, what we should be doing is wanting the poor to be richer, and that's the if that so happens that there's greater equality as a result of the as a result of sort of the focus, the priority being to get the poor rich, then that's fine. Well, I don't think that either politically or morally that free marketeers would have an objection to that being a priority. And I think there would be ways of doing that I would think would be using free market potential. I think if you've got an area where it's a particularly rundown region, or you've got a particular sector where people are finding it hard to compete, I think you could apply with free ports is one example. I think is I think is in very much in the tradition of the enterprise zones that we had from the Thatcher government. I hope, if anything, we'll be rather more radical and go and further, and that's something that's more effective than the traditional statist sort of regional aid thing, which has been ineffective. I think you could certainly apply tax cuts in a way that you could try and target that to try and level up a particular region or particular section of the population. And I think this would make perfectly good sense. I think the difficulty that Rachel has, and a lot of people have a misunderstanding, is to somehow think that if you believe in the free market, you're somehow indifferent to the poor, and you don't care about trying to reduce poverty. And I think that's the sort of fundamental misunderstanding that she had.
I mean, economically speaking, the levelling up agenda is incredibly important, because we are in by some measures, we're almost two different countries, London and the southeast versus, the rest of the nation. What do you think lies at the root of the problem when it comes to regional inequality? I mean, people have been talking about it as a problem for decades, and successive governments have said that they were going to tackle it. But how did we get here?
Well, I think there would be, from a free market perspective, we'd look at particular difficulties in terms of local government, and why particular policies of the local government might have put people off investing in Liverpool or some of these other cities, not just in terms of the amount of spending, but also in terms of a sort of anti regeneration policy, in terms of the lots of derelict land being hoarded at local government level, and sort of business investors being being warned off and treated as being unwelcome. So there's sort of anti-enterprise culture that's existed in some cities as part of it. I think there would be a legacy. There's a particular area that was very dependent on old industry. That's a problem. I think welfare dependency. If you get if you get sort of an area where a large number of people are trapped on welfare, trapped in bad housing, that's discouraging to people. I think it's so. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, rather than just saying, well, we'll apply free market policies evenly, to say, well, they need help, but that doesn't mean extra socialism. That means a particular sharp jolt of free market shock treatment to get the enterprise culture flourishing in parts of the country where it's not at the moment.
Yeah, I suppose the free market is going to be of more benefit to places that don't already have it. Lots of cities, London especially, is very free market, pro-enterprise, and some other regions aren't, I suppose. Some experts would argue that the divide, north-south divide, levelling up, whatever you want to call it, is inevitable, because people are always going to be encouraged to move to places with better jobs and opportunities, and that sadly inevitably means moving away from places with fewer jobs and fewer opportunities. So do you think we should make it easier for people to do that, liberalise planning in more prosperous areas to build more housing, for example? This probably would exacerbate the divide, but if that's where people want to be, is that not the sensible response?
I think having said that I'm a champion of the levelling up thing, I think there's obviously a limit to how much people who legitimately regard themselves as libertarian can do in terms of people will choose. And housing is a big one, isn't it? I would say that a huge part of the levelling up agenda would be for people who aren't homeowners for it to be affordable to them to become homeowners, and people talk about the housing market. I mean, the difficulty is we don't have a functioning housing market because the planning system greatly restrains the supply of new homes, and the state is a huge hoarder of land. I mean, vast amounts of land and surplus buildings that the state hangs on to. And if we had complete liberalisation of the planning rules, and also the state released a lot of surplus land, that would greatly increase the housing supply. Now, it wouldn't necessarily mean that people, would cease to prefer living in one part of the country than another part. I mean, I think that even with people moving out of London because of coronavirus, that there's still, to incredibly much higher prices in London than elsewhere. And I think that I don't think anybody can do much about that, but it certainly would be possible to level up, in that house prices could be much lower if the housing supply was dramatically increased, and that would make it much more affordable for people on average income to become homeowners. Again, I think very much in the tradition of Thatcher, in terms of the right to buy for council tenants was a huge levelling up, and the Thatcher era of making home ownership more affordable. Possibly not completely purist. Some free market people will say, well, why should they be sold at a discount? Why not just sell them? But I think that in terms of the political practicalities of it, it was a very effective way of rolling back the state as the rhetoric at the time, and of increasing home ownership and of levelling up.
Well, I suppose if you own your own home, it's a tangible incentive to continue investing in other ways in your local area, whereas if you're just renting, there's a sense of passing through rather than committing to one place. We mentioned the attractiveness of London in terms of house prices. How concerned are you that the pandemic will actually see a levelling down rather than a levelling up? I mean, if places, city centres, London especially, become less attractive places to live, it will probably benefit other regions because, the attractiveness of concentrating in London is diminished. But actually, given how much of the country's economic output comes from the capital, isn't it a concern that we may in fact level down instead of levelling up?
Oh, look, I think if house prices go down in London relative to the rest of the country, that would be a good thing from the point of view of people, including lots of friends of mine who, I mean, I'm fortunate enough to have bought a while ago, but there are friends of mine who want to live in London and want to be able to buy, and at the moment that seems very distant. So I think that if that changed with people moving, with people selling in London and buying elsewhere, I think that would probably be good. But as we were discussing, I mean, I think that if it happens, it happens. I don't think that really the state sort of should be getting involved in. I think what the state could probably be doing, I'm certainly be doing, is to be making it much easier to increase the housing supply across the whole country, and that would mean that it would be more affordable everywhere, even if it was still more of a struggle in London than other parts of the country.
Rachel's article in the Times focuses on the challenges that the levelling up agenda may pose the government in terms of, do we level up in a free market way or a more public spending funded way? But it's fair to say it's a tricky area for the Labour Party as well. I mean, part of the reason that the Red Wall collapsed so dramatically in 2019 is that traditionally Labour voting areas were fed up of decades of underinvestment, seeing their local economies stagnate under Labour MPs and Labour-run councils, although obviously governments of all shades. How do you think the Labour Party will respond to that challenge?
I think they've got a difficult situation, the Labour Party, in their electoral coalition, in that the divide over how people vote now is much more to do with age. With the Labour Party doing much better among the young, and the pensioners overwhelmingly being Conservative. In terms of it, the divide we used to have, the sort of class divide, the divide between rich and poor, if anything, the opinion polling I've seen is that the Conservatives, doing slightly better among the working class, and Labour doing slightly better among the middle class. I guess if you drill down into that, you'd look at the particular occupations where, the public sector, people employed in the public sector, Labour were able to doing much better than maybe, sort of the small businessman might still be more inclined to be conservative. But I think that does cause a problem for Labour, in that a lot of their existing supporters and MPs and so on are from that background, and are therefore quite interested in some of the culture war stuff that their traditional working class supporters, who thought the point about voting Labour was that they would help the poor and give the poor a better deal and stand up for the poor against the rich, and it was seen as that kind of division. I think they will have trouble reconnecting with that group, and I don't think that it'll be easy for them. I think for them to Labour to do well in that area, they'll be sort of relying on the Conservatives making a mess of things, which of course might easily happen. But I don't think it'll be easy for Labour on their own terms to reconnect with those supporters that they've lost in what was called the Red Wall.
One last question. Obviously, Boris Johnson in the 2019 election, I think, had two main pillars. One was get Brexit done, and the other was, levelling up what the freedoms that Brexit gives us can deliver for the sort of left behind regions of Britain. How important do you think it is for him that in 4 years' time, just under 4 years' time, when we get to the next election, he is able to point to some successes in the levelling up agenda? If he isn't able to secure some wins in this policy arena, how damaging do you think that could be?
Oh, I think he does need to become bolder about it. And one of the things is to get on with it, because some of these changes that might be controversial, and people might think, these sort of this deregulation will result in threats to the environment, or threats to health and safety, or sort of damaging working conditions or whatever. And there's a lot of any sort of radical changes. There's a lot of vulnerability to scaremongering, and the only way to really, if you actually believe it's the right thing to do and be beneficial, is to through and then allow time for those benefits to be proven before the next general election. So I think from the point of view of controversial change, he hasn't got all that long, because he's only just with the Brexit, the deregulation possible from Brexit. It's only able to start now. So there's been a year that's been lost sort of waiting to be permitted to do it, and then there's the legislation and giving it time to prove its success. So no, I think it does need to get on with it, and I think a lot of the deregulation, where that would sort of bit tie in with the some of the red wall seats, is that it's not the big companies that lost out so much from all the sort of cosy corporatist EU thing. A lot of it, there is the small and medium-sized businesses that have really struggled with the red tape. A lot of these that would be outside London, and so I think that potentially could have a big impact, but it would need quite a bit of political courage for it to be significant.
I suppose then we need to get our move on with it. Thanks, Harry, for joining us. To all our viewers and listeners, if you agree with Harry that levelling up can be done in a free market pro-enterprise way, well, we've got the competition for you. This year's Richard Koch Breakthrough Prize is offering a £50,000 top prize for answers to the following question. In the current severe economic climate, what pro-market, pro-enterprise policy would be the best way of supercharging growth, employment and living standards in left-behind Britain? It's a 2-stage entry process, so entrants are initially asked to submit a very short summary of their idea, 500 to 1,000 words, and the deadline for the first round is 12 p.m. on the 2nd of March, so you still have a little bit of time to get in touch with your bright ideas for levelling up. You can find out more about the competition and register your entry at breakthroughprize.org.uk, and we'll pop a link to that in the show notes. Don't forget, while you're there, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, IEA London, follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, or subscribe to the IEA podcast on Apple, Spotify or Podbean. Thanks, Harry, very much for joining me. Thanks to everyone for watching and listening, and thanks to the IEA donors who make all of our work possible.